Hi everybody, and just like that, it is week 4 of the semester. And this week we are talking about assessment design and planning. And so as I shared in our video for last week, I like to put the learning objectives that are addressed in the week, and of course these are our learning objectives at the course level. So I hope that as you're going through each week, you're taking a look back at the learning objectives for the course, and I want to make sure that as much as possible, you see yourself as a co-driver in the experience in this course. That obviously I've laid things out in a particular order in the syllabus, and that's the map that we're following. That's our roadway that we're traveling down together. But in terms of what you take away from the course and how you apply what we're covering this semester in terms of your development as a professional in post-secondary education, I want to make sure that you see yourself as integral in that process moving forward, that you're not simply a receptor of information in this program. So anyway, enough of that little tangent. Let's get on to talking about assessment design and planning. And when I think about assessment design and planning, I think about the assessment cycle. And there are a number of different depictions of it, and you will see me use a couple of different variations of this as we go through the course and I revisit it in different ways throughout the semester. But generally speaking, this is the way that I think about assessment. As I've mentioned previously, I think about assessment as an all-encompassing approach to learning a few different things. Learning about what students learn, and learning about what our department or our division, our university, or even smaller, on more micro level, in a specific program or activity, what do we do? What do we do well? Where do we need to improve? So regardless of the lens that we use or the particular focus, everything, when I think about assessment, is about learning. And sometimes that gets framed as improvement, but I worry sometimes that when we focus our attention on improvement, that sets us up for a deficit mindset. And regardless of if we have things we need to improve, or we're setting the standard for a particular activity or action in post-secondary education, we need to make sure that we are assessing what we're doing so we can either make adjustments as needed or keep on doing what we're doing because we do it really well. But anyway, this is the cycle that I think through when I think about assessment planning. And you can see that it starts at objectives, goes through 6 other pieces, and then comes back to objectives. And so I want to spend some time in this video talking through each of these pieces, some in a little bit more detail than others, and we're going to address all of these pieces as we go through the course. And so if you look at the course layout, either the way it's laid out in Canvas or in our schedule document that accompanies the syllabus, you'll notice you notice all of these pieces coming out or coming through the course and following this order that's laid out. So in thinking through objectives, it's really, for me, it's about determining the purpose of what we're doing in the guise of assessment. So in other words, what is it that our department does that we're trying to assess? And the way that we get at that is thinking about what are the outcomes of those actions. So what should students learn as a result of participating in something? What are the ways that students' development is affected by participation? What is it that the organization itself does? What are the processes and procedures that are followed? So one of the things that we'll talk about when we cover learning outcomes is what's pictured on the screen right now is usually what comes to mind when we hear learning outcomes. But we also have to be mindful of the fact that we need to assess processes that take place that are not directly connected to student learning and or student development. So when we talk about and address learning outcomes, I believe it's next week, I'm going to make sure to point out some examples and provide a walkthrough, if you will, of how to look at learning outcomes, and maybe even strip out that word learning, how to look at outcomes that that we can assess and that we can use to drive our assessment efforts. So ideally, we're taking our outcomes from our broader statements, such as mission statements, goal statements, strategic initiative statements, whatever those might be. And outcomes should be framed around where do we want either our department or students to be at the end of an experience. So we're going to go through some examples from our PSE program in a couple of slides that I hope kind of bring this into focus a little bit more as we go through some examples that almost everyone in this class has that direct experience with. Hopefully you've looked at them before if you're on the PSE program. So one of the things when it comes to outcomes is we want to make sure that they're actually useful for us. And in the world of assessment, this series of 7 questions are the things that I look at. So one of your assignments is about writing learning outcomes. When I review the learning outcomes that you submit, I'm actually going to have these 7 questions on the screen next to your submission. Now, this isn't a way, each one of these bullet points isn't worth X points or anything like that, but it's a way not only of me assessing your work, but it's a way for me to help provide some constructive feedback. So we want to make sure that our outcomes are measurable. And this can be a difficult one to think about at first, because I think a lot of times we're used to seeing outcomes that are kind of lofty. So as a result, here's an example that's lofty. As a result of attending a student leadership conference, students will be better prepared to be leaders. That's a great outcome. It sounds really great, but I don't know how measurable that is. How do we measure great leader? It's very subjective. It's hard to put some sort of objective measure or set of measures to that statement. And so I think after going through the readings, which hopefully you do, obviously there's no way for me to verify that you go through readings unless we do a bunch of reading quizzes, but particularly in an online course, there's a lot of self-direction required. But as you go through those readings, and hopefully this video kind of pulls pieces together in a somewhat succinct fashion. I try to keep these as brief as possible. These the approaches to learning outcomes as something, as a piece with utility comes together for you. So we want to make sure that those outcome statements are measurable. We want to make sure that they're meaningful. So we want to, and when I say meaningful, it's that the outcome statement has meaning for us as a department or a division, whatever the level is, whatever our lens is organizationally. But also remember that we're not the only ones on the assessment side. We're not the only ones interacting with outcomes. People who are tasked with delivering programs and services, they're hopefully involved with crafting learning outcomes as well. The students who maybe we're assessing their learning, ideally they're seeing these outcomes, because one of the things that we want to use outcomes for is to show participants or stakeholders what they can expect to get out of an experience and what they can expect to be able to demonstrate, and or whatever the action verb is that we're using to construct that learning outcome. Is it manageable? So to me, a lot of times this goes hand in hand with answering the question of an outcome being measurable. If is an outcome manageable, is it realistic? Can we reasonably expect that student engaging in activity X has a likely or a high probability of achieving outcome Y? And so that's what I mean by manageable. The outcome should clearly state who the target audience is. And so if we're looking at student learning from a particular program, maybe it's students who participate in new student recruitment for a Greek letter organization. Now that's a very specific target audience, but if we're assessing something related to new student recruitment and we work in Greek life, we need to be specific. We want to make sure that folks who participate in those programs understand that, oh, okay, wow, this outcome is about me. It's about my experience. So and then the fifth bullet should say how, or no, yeah, that's correct. Who would know if my outcome has been met? Well, that's part of identifying the audience. So the participants should know. There should be some demonstrable outcome that goes back to being, is it meaningful and manageable? Can participants who complete an experience talk about their experience in a meaningful way connected to the outcome? How will I know if the outcome has been met? Well, this is a piece that relates to something being bounded by a particular time context. So maybe the outcome is students participating in new member recruitment for a Greek letter organization will be able to identify their place or their role with the organization's philanthropy by the end of the recruitment process. So there's something very specific, measurable, meaningful, because it connects the values of the organization to a philanthropy, and it's bounded by a particular time context. So by the time that the recruitment period ends. Now that's generally a specific duration for many Greek letter organizations. Sometimes it's not, but there's still some sort of end point that is identifiable. And then the last bullet point, we'll want to make sure that there's some sort of evidence that comes out of assessing the outcome. So we want to make sure there's data that we can gather and use for continuous improvement and for decision making that's connected to continuous improvement. So if we end up with an outcome that's kind of tells us almost a yes or no, I don't know how much that helps us. So if the outcome were framed around, do students will know the values of their organization by the end of the recruitment period. To me, that's almost do they know it or they don't know if that really gives us data that helps us work towards improvement. So let's say that there's some sort of, we see an issue with recruitment efforts among some organizations, some Greek letter organizations, whether it's low numbers or there's been concerns about hazing or some concerns about dirty rushing, whatever it might be. We want data that we can use to help frame those approaches to continuous improvement. So let's look at some examples from the post-secondary ed master's program. Now these are the 6 learning outcomes that we use as a program to frame our assessment efforts for Murray State University. So every academic unit on campus has some set of student learning outcomes. And I'm not going to read these off to you. You can look at them, and I want you to think through, and then we're not going to have a discussion board about this, but I want you to look at these and critique them. So when you pull up this video and you watch it, if you want to take a look at the PowerPoint that is posted on Canvas, this is slide number 8. So take a look at these. And if you want to shoot me a note, shoot me an email, let me know what you think. I'll share. I didn't write them. No, so if they're great, I can't take credit for them. If you think they stink, I can't be faulted for them, right? So I am completely uh, disavowed from any praise or blame for these. Um, and if we were face to face, I would be giggling about that, and I'd be making some sort of joke. Um, but I do want y'all's impact. I want your perspective on these. Think about them in the context of the last slide with those questions about outcome statements. Are these measurable? Are they meaningful? Are they manageable? Is there some sort of time context? Or is there a time context that's implied because it's specific to a master's program? Um, or is the intended audience or participant clearly delineated in each statement? So think through those. And again, this isn't an assignment or anything. If you feel so compelled to let me know your thoughts, I would love to hear those. And so when we think about outcomes, we need to think about what does it really take? Having an outcome statement is one thing, but then what does it take in order to put that outcome into operation? What does it take to develop some sort of process around assessing that outcome? And so one of the assignments for this course is, of course, the CAS audit of the post-secondary ed program. And you can see here a portion of our assessment plan that we provide to the Office of Institutional Effectiveness related to this course. And this is drawn from one of the student learning outcomes that was on the previous screen. And you can see this is kind of a general description, of the overall CAS assignment in terms of at the end point what happens. And so I just used that as an example because we just looked through the student learning outcomes for a program and then wanted to provide an example of what do we as a program do with those? How do we attempt to assess those? And so at Murray State University, for each student learning outcome, each academic unit is expected to have at least 2 formative measures of assessment. So formative measures of assessment are those items which are evaluated or measured during a student's experience, and whether it's during the course or during the master's program overall, those would be formative measures or formative tests. And then summative assessments, which are at the end of an experience. And so by and large, in the PSE program, the Capstone Research Project serves as our summative assessment for almost all of the learning outcomes. So we've got our outcomes, then we need to think through how to evaluate them. And this is critical. I think this is where some folks get tripped up at times when thinking through the assessment process and planning assessment efforts for whatever level they're working at. We need to think on the front end about how we're going to evaluate a particular outcome or evaluate a program. And so we need to think through what are the data sources that we need in order to assess each outcome, and what are the levels of analysis that are appropriate for each of those data sources in order for us to make sure there's a match from outcome statement to data collection and then data analysis. And so there needs to be a very clear line connecting all 3 of those pieces. So before we choose that evaluation method or the assessment method, we want to make sure that we have a clear understanding of what meeting the outcome looks like. So every outcome needs to have some sort of action verb. And I'm going to post some other resources about writing learning outcomes. They hopefully I already have them in week 5 where we address learning outcomes. But I'm going to post it for whatever's over there. I'm also going to supplement it for our week 4 material, because thinking through learning outcomes is such a big part of the assessment planning process, or I think it should be. So remember that a lot of what I share in this course is based on kind of the way I think about assessment, and the way that I've framed that thinking over time has been through some experiences I've had, but also some conversations that I have with folks who are engaged in this work as their full-time job. And so once I get the tech side figured out, I'm going to have some of those folks join me for some discussion via a podcast format, and hope to have those posting to Canvas pretty soon. So that was another tangent. Yes, even on the videos, I get into the trap of tangents. So also, when we're thinking through how are we actually going to assess what's going on, now obviously that assessment framed through those outcomes, we want to have clearly articulated criteria so that we know when an outcome has been met. And we also need to describe the how. And so this kind of links back to thinking through outcomes, but also if we're thinking through how, what it is, the how of what we do to deliver on an outcome also can point us to thinking through data collection and data analysis issues and concerns. So if some of this seems a little disjointed right now and seems a little superficial, like I said at the beginning of the video, we're going to go into more depth on all of these as we go through the semester. I just want to provide an overview right now. So next in the cycle comes assessment implementation. This is where I think a lot of folks spend most, if not all, of their time in assessment. Maybe some folks spend a little bit of time writing learning outcomes, but then so often we fall into this trap of, oh my gosh, we don't know, or we haven't done a survey in 3 hours, let's send out another survey. And so we survey our students to death, and our students are sick of surveys, and we get about a 3% return rate on any survey we send our students. So let's quit doing that. But instead, let's think about, again, back to the previous slides on evaluation methods, what is the data that we really need? What data really helps us answer our questions and helps us know, or really helps us answer the questions that come from the learning outcomes? And then it's time, so once we have those things figured out, then we need to go through the actual collection of data. And of course, assessment implementation is more than data collection. This is, we determine our sampling frame, our sampling strategies, we recruit participants, we administer whatever the data collection process is, we get the data, we do things with the data, we analyze it. Hopefully we don't just put it in a binder somewhere to sit on the bookshelf in a director's office, but we go through this process. Generally what we think about in terms of the doing of research, which is going through the procedures and steps that we covered in ADM630. But of course there are things we need to make sure that we think through when we're planning the implementation portion. Who's going to be the person charged with analyzing data? I have seen departments be gung-ho with collecting data, but they didn't think through the process of data analysis. Not just what the procedures that need to be used depending on the data type, but who's going to do it. And that's where we end up getting in this problem of data hoarding. And there's been some stuff about data hoarding in a couple of posts that I follow online. If I can find them again, I'll share them on Canvas. But the problem with data hoarding isn't that we get all this data and we're just flush with data. It's that we don't plan out what to do with it. We don't plan who's going to work with it. We need to also think through beyond that immediate need of who's going to analyze the data, who else needs it? Are we collecting data that is of use to another department on campus? And sometimes people don't think through that question because we live in our own little silos and we're territorial, and we say, you know what, no, my data is my data. I work in Res Life. That's it. It's mine. They're my students after all. The registrar's office can't have it. Greek Life can't have it. And so we become a bunch of four-year-olds who determine that we're the only one who can ever touch the football. And if someone else tries to touch the football, we pick it up and we run home. If that's not a good analogy for you, then I guess that was just my childhood. And so one of the things we also have to recognize, I realize I started a lot of statements with one of the things, but we also need to plan out around the reality that for many cases, I don't want to say most because that might be an over-exaggeration, but many cases, assessment efforts are not someone's full-time job. That because assessment is becoming increasingly important, and at least we all profess to understand and see the value in it, it can be difficult to find the institutional resources to pay folks to do this on a full-time basis, particularly at the individual department level. So imagine if you are a department of 3 people, I'll use an example, Greek Life at the University of Alabama. If you follow anything about Greek Life, you know that every year Alabama brings in the largest recruitment class for new member recruitment for the NPC sororities every fall, and it grows every year. And so the number of young women who go through new member recruitment are, I want to say, the 1,500 to 2,000 range, something like that. And that's huge. That's a huge number of students. And there are 3 full-time professionals who work with Greek Life at that institution. Assessment is not a full-time responsibility for any of those professional staff, and they don't have a budget to have a full-time assessment person in their office. So then when it comes to assessment needs, they have to figure out how does it fit into their regular responsibilities. And then beyond that, who is responsible for making decisions, or who needs to be included for making decisions with that data and with the results? Remember, when we talk about making decisions with data, it's after we've done analysis. That's what matters. It's not looking at a spreadsheet or everyone opening up a spreadsheet on their computer in Google Sheets and looking at averages or anything like that. Data analysis is hopefully more robust than that, regardless of the type of data that is collected. So we want to make sure that everyone who needs to be included in making decisions has access to those results from the analysis. And that's one of those things to think through on the front end. Because if you think, oh, I'll remember to include folks on the back end, and you don't document that for yourself, if you're the person doing the assessment planning, trust me, you forget. You forget to include someone, and it's a sin of oversight. It's one of those things that, I didn't mean to forget about Sally, and guess what? Sally is upset. Sally's feelings have been hurt, and Sally is coming for you. You don't want to be in that position. I put myself in that position before. You don't want to be there. I didn't think about that 4th bullet deep enough with some work that I was doing. And then the final point on this slide, how we document the evidence and the decisions from that evidence. It is critical that everything that goes on with assessment is documented. take notes. If you're the person doing this stuff, whether it's your full-time job or you did like I did, you say, hey, director of department, I'd like to learn more about assessment. And director says, that's great. Here's the assessment binder. You are now our assessment person. Go forth and assess. I took notes. I made notes for myself. I won't want to say I kept a journal, but I recorded thoughts and observations for myself. And that became part of kind of my ongoing record. So I was recording, what did I do? What was I doing to go through the process? What successes and failures did I have with various steps along the way in the assessment cycle? But then even beyond that, here's the evidence that we collected. Here are the results, and here's where it's been shared. Part of that's a little bit of cover your butt approach. You don't want to be on the receiving end of fingers being pointed about, well, somebody said that we sent out all these surveys. I haven't seen thing one about them. Well, somebody said that. I was able to document. Well, I have a record that I sent out an executive summary to the director of every department on campus, and I sent a full report to these following 5 people outside of the department, and then all the professional staff within my department. Things like that. And then from there, documenting conversations in staff meetings that were where that evidence was used to frame decision making. I'm actually going to gloss over this, and actually by gloss over, I mean skip over it. One of the things I want to just kind of reinforce by putting this up here is there are a variety of methods for assessing student learning, and they're not all numerical in nature. And so you can see surveys are on there, and criteria and rubrics are on there. Those are generally what we think of in terms of capturing numeric data around student learning. But you can see that there are 5 other bullet points that kind of point us towards more qualitative approaches. So I hit on this with the assessment implementation because for me, it is difficult to separate out planning for data collection separate from planning for data analysis. But we do need to make sure that we are very, very clear in what we plan to do with data once we get it. And then once we write up results, how are we going to disseminate that information? So I kind of hit on that a couple of slides ago, so I'm not going to restate any of that information. So one of the things that we use, as I noted on the tools for measuring learning slide, are rubrics. And you see these there aren't numbers anywhere on here. Now we could probably assign these numbers, and we do. An exceeds is a 4, a meets is a 3, a below expected is a 2, a does not meet is a 1, whatever the scale is. And so sometimes we can use this so that we have some sort of score, but for me, rubrics are important because it gives us a way to really think about what we're assessing in terms of student performance. That's the most frequent use of rubrics in assessment, is for assessing student performance or student learning. But it's also, I like the value of rubrics in providing feedback to students or participants. That if I mark someone as below expected on foundations of knowledge, well, there's a description here, but then I can also provide further feedback based on this description. So it provides me as an assessor a means of, okay, there's something lacking in what you submitted related to foundations of knowledge. Let's talk about what specifically I saw in what you produced. And so it's a good tool. But then when we think about looking at a set of rubrics as a complete data set, we can see, okay, X% of students scored at below expected foundations of knowledge. wow, we need to do something in our program or in our course, our leadership seminar, whatever it is, to better address foundations of knowledge. And finally, or not finally, but sorry to get you excited, we need to make sure that we have a plan for using the data that we analyze, that we have a process in place in our department for working with that information to talk and talking about it. And so if I'm the assessment person for my department, but I'm not the director of that department, I want to make sure I'm having regular conversations with the director or other people up on the org chart who are responsible for leading the department in making decisions to make sure that assessment is on the agenda for meetings at strategic points. Because if it's not an agenda item either regularly or at strategic points throughout a semester or year, it's not going to be discussed. You can't, it's tough to come in and be the assessment person and come in the room and say, oh, hey, by the way, we got all the results done and we've written up the report. I hope everybody had time to read it. Oh no, we're out of time in our meeting today because this wasn't an agenda item that was prioritized or wasn't even an agenda item in the first place. So we want to make sure that assessment is seen as critical and meaningful and is a regular part of those conversations. And one of the things we also have to do is, in terms of making decisions recommendations, in this rubric or part of the assessment plan for the PSE program, we see that we had a plan in place that using those results, we see, okay, we really don't need to do anything yet because we have such a small sample, a small population to draw data from. But so far, based on the learning outcome related to diversity, that at the formative level through the HDL 670 course, our students scored, all of them scored exceeds the standard and the chosen criteria that were most relevant from the rubric, most relevant to that learning outcome for the program. So assessment definitely leads to more reports, which are more things to read or more things to be ignored. But one of the things I want to stress, and there I go saying one of the things again, is it doesn't have to be lengthy reports. It doesn't have to be a bunch of words and tables and charts. We can make them fun. And so when we talk about reporting later this semester, we're going to look at ways that some departments around the country and in Canada have utilized to approach reporting in some different ways, through infographics, through YouTube videos, through social media, through a number of different ways to get the results out there, and also sharing what's being done with that information back out to students, back out to stakeholders. And so again, we report results plus recommendations and decisions. It's not just here's what we found, but it should be here's what we found and here's what we're doing about it. And then the next step in the process is starting it all over again. And sometimes the process can be a series of overlapping processes or intersecting processes. And so that's it. Sorry for the long video. I will either break it up in the future so you don't have to sit through as much, or let me know if the length of these videos is okay, or if you'd like to have smaller multiple chunks.